Welcome to the Fibromyalgia podcast with me, Health and Wellness Editor, Verity. Fibromyalgia is a chronic pain condition which goes largely undiagnosed and for which there is currently no cure. Yet in the UK alone, it is estimated that around 1.5 million people are sufferers. Poor diagnosis and zero cure mean suffering in silence is a common theme in the chronic pain community. Created in conjunction with the Fibromyalgia Magazine, this podcast aims to break this silence because we believe that the more we share, the more ways we will discover for fibromyalgia sufferers to lead happier, healthier lives. We'll be covering and oversharing everything you ever wanted to ask about fibromyalgia, but didn't know who or where to turn to, with conversations with some of the most interesting and thought-leading people, both within as well as outside of the fibromyalgia space, to give you information, insight, and inspiration for diagnosing and coping with fibromyalgia. Because even though something is invisible, that doesn't mean it should be kept in the dark. This week, I'm joined by nutritional therapist Jacqui Mize. The food we eat has an enormous impact on our health, and this was something which Jacqui became acutely aware of when she herself was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. After 5 years of trying all sorts of conventional and alternative approaches in order to improve her condition, it wasn't until Jacqui overhauled her diet that she saw a dramatic improvement in her health. As a nutritional therapist, Jacqui takes a holistic approach to restoring health and works with her patients to balance the body systems and allow the body to heal and nourish itself with the foods that are beneficial, whilst avoiding foods which are not. Nutritional therapy looks to rectify the underlying cause of illness, rather than simply treating the symptoms. And Jacqui firmly believes that our healthcare systems need to shift away from simply prescribing a pill for an ill and move towards functional medicine, where the cause is directly addressed. Because when it comes to the health of society as a whole, prevention is better than cure. Hi Jacqui, it's so great to have you on the Fibromyalgia podcast with me today. Thank you for taking time out of your clinic to join me. So we're here today to talk all things food, nutrition and related to fibromyalgia. And before we get on to that, I'd like to for you to intro how you got into this space. So before you became a nutritional therapist, you had another career in television, right? And they seem worlds apart. So what prompted the shift to go from TV to NT?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for having me. So I became a nutritional therapist because of my own fibromyalgia, actually. So you're right, I did work in TV for many years. I was a production exec with a very busy schedule, working very long hours, eating I think I lived on baked potatoes and Diet Coke at the time, and trying to do that and have two small children and a busy family and things. And after the birth of my second child, I started getting pains in my hands, and nobody could tell me what that was. And that pain gradually spread to other areas of my body, and I spent about 5 years trying to find out what was wrong with me before a rheumatologist actually diagnosed me with fibromyalgia. And we tried all sorts of things, but nothing really made a difference. And I think I have to thank my lovely husband, who I'd come home from appointments feeling very depressed and feeling very down and thinking, I'm 30 years old and this is going to be it. And he kept saying, no, it's not. We will find the answer. And eventually a friend said, why don't you go and see a nutritional therapist? And I said, well, why do I need to do that? I know what I need to eat, and actually, that's not going to make a difference. And she said, just try it. And I went to see a nutritional therapist who, I have to say, completely changed my life, because 15 years ago I wouldn't have been sitting at my desk doing work. I would have been struggling to get up and downstairs and get out of bed on days and those kind of things. And actually it made such a difference to me that after being well for a while, I actually thought, do you know what, actually I'd really like to help other people find the solution to their pain and change their lives. And actually television's a young person's job, and it's not something you can do for ages, certainly not with children. So I decided to retrain, and I went and did a degree in nutritional therapist and in nutritional therapy, and then I have been kind of started focusing on fibromyalgia, but that's diversified quite a lot, and I see all sorts of people now. But I suppose the thing I feel most passionate about is people with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue.
Yeah. So in those kind of 5 years that you were searching for answers, did food ever come up in the conversations? Was diet ever mentioned?
No, food never came up. Diet was never mentioned in any way by any of the specialists that I saw or the GPs that I saw. No.
And then on your first meeting with a nutritional therapist, how did that work? What did they address? What kind of things did they then put in place for you?
So basically, they were very thorough, and they did a full health history and went through everything that had happened in the past and my symptoms and what I was eating. And they did some tests, and they found out that I was deficient in certain nutrients. We didn't do any stool testing at the time, but actually he could tell from the state of my digestion that I probably wasn't absorbing that well on the nutrient front. He asked me to take out quite a lot of foods from my diet that I wasn't, were aggravating the digestive symptoms. And then he packed me off and said, "Great, I'll see you in 6 weeks." And I walked out of there thinking, how on earth am I going to do this? And actually, it's something I've learned not to do to my patients. I do send them off with food plans and ideas and recipes and all those kind of things, because actually he basically told me to stop eating most of what I was eating, which I wouldn't do to anyone now. But I was so desperate at the time that I actually did do it, and I felt very different quite quickly.
Really?
Within 2 or 3 months, I was a very different person, and it wasn't just the way I felt, but it was the way I looked and my ability to operate as a kind of normal, healthy human being.
I mean, that's quite phenomenal, isn't it? Going from kind of 5 years of, as you said, not even being able to sit at your desk and work, to one meeting with somebody, changes in your diet 2 months later to be fit and functioning again.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it had such a profound effect on me that was what made me retrain.
Yeah. So then you retrained, and as part of your training, you did a thesis specifically looking at the link between fibromyalgia and food. So then, what were your findings? Is there a direct link?
So there is a direct link for some people. I mean, the thing about fibromyalgia is what causes fibromyalgia for one person is not the same as what causes fibromyalgia for another person. And that's why I work very much in a functional medicine way, because I'm looking at what the triggers are for that person, what the etiology is for that person's condition. Food plays a huge role in that, otherwise nutritional therapy wouldn't be able to help. But for some people, there are commonalities. So for instance, sugar is a big one with someone who's got an inflammatory type condition, because sugar is one of the most inflammatory molecules that we can eat. So those kind of things. But for some people, there's food intolerances. So for some people, it's gluten. For some people, it's dairy. For some people, it's nightshade family of foods.
So that's things like aubergines.
Yeah,
onions.
So potatoes, aubergines, tomatoes, not onion. As I said, potatoes, aubergines, tomatoes, peppers, and chilies, those kind of things. And even within that, if you took 5 people who were sensitive to those, some of which would get mild joint pain 2 days later, some of which would be floored for 3 or 4 days with migraines and just complete lack of energy. So even if you found a commonality with food, it affects people differently. But those were the sorts of things. So definitely sugar, definitely lack of essential fats. So things like oily fish, nuts and seeds, the essential fats modulate inflammatory pathways. And then there's food intolerances. So your common food intolerances are gluten, dairy, eggs, soy, corn are common, but some people don't have any of those, some people have all of those.
Presumably then it's quite a long-winded process to kind of find what makes people tick or trigger them.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we tend to do is the first appointment that I do is normally an hour and a half, and that involves a kind of full-on health history. And prior to that, I've had a 5-page form which gives me time to prep and understand, a person's case. And then, in that we go through people's diets. At the moment, what I tend to do is I tend to put people on a kind of modern paleo diet or modified paleo diet. I find the autoimmune paleo diet a little too restrictive for lots of people. So as a first step, I normally kind of think of a paleo type diet. So actually not really raw food, because raw food is really quite hard to digest. So I tend to say to people, if you're having digestive symptoms, don't go raw salads and things like that, because they're too hard to digest. But a paleo diet tends to be kind of low in grains, gluten-free, dairy-free, definitely sugar-free, and then we work back up from there. So I'm not saying that I blanketly take everybody off all those foods, but actually I'd say the gold standard of food allergy testing is removing a food for a while and then challenging it. That's much more comprehensive than any blood test you can have, because actually then your body tells you whether you're reacting to it or not.
And then would you create kind of specific meal plans for people?
Absolutely. I tend to do, rather than specific meal plans for individuals, I have, kind of suggested menus for people, because I want people to be able to kind of buy into it themselves and understand what they're supposed to eat, rather than me just telling them what to eat. So, we work together to create plans which have, kind of several breakfasts, several lunches, several dinners, but also a kind of list of foods that you can eat with impunity. And people often think, if I'm going to take food out, that's going to make it a really restrictive diet, but there's so much you can eat that is non-reactive for people. And
you mentioned that it took many years before you came across a nutritional therapist. Do you find it similar with your patients, that they're coming to you having tried and exhausted lots of different therapies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm very much at the end of the line. I think I see a lot of people who've kind of been through lots of different doctors, consultants, other complementary therapists as well, before they think about diet.
It's so mad, isn't it? Because really, when you think about it, changing your diet is kind of quite minor than kind of a lifetime of pills and drugs and tests and things. I mean, are you working with other practitioners and doctors to kind of get diet pushed further up the pecking order?
I think as a profession we are generally. I think it's an interesting one. I think there's a whole new school of doctors who are very willing and understand the whole, what you eat is what drives you. I think there's still quite a lot of resistance, and I think I think that's changing considerably. Even if you look at the difference between dietitians in the NHS and nutritional therapists, 15 years ago we used to be very different. Actually, now we're not so different. Now we kind of think about on the same lines as well. So I think things are changing. I think we've got an awful long way to go. I think, we live in a society where medicine is very much about cure rather than prevention. And actually, I think, people are realizing that needs to change, because I just think from nothing else but a financial point of view, we can't carry on, just curing. We need to actually stop people getting conditions in the first place. Otherwise, the NHS is not going to be able to manage.
Yeah, so talking about fibromyalgia then, obviously there's no kind of known cure, and equally there's no kind of known cause, but having been through it yourself and seen lots of patients with it, are you able to see a pattern at all in the root cause?
I think there are commonalities. Definitely. So, when I did my dissertation, when I was at university training to be a nutritional therapist, one of the things that I had to do was a literature review. And an area that I really found fascinating was the fact that between 90 and 100% of people with fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue or ME have an imbalance of gut flora. And so that is, you ask any nutritional therapist, they'll start in the gut, because there is now so much research looking at the impact of gut bacterial balance on health, on mood, on cognitive function, the whole works. So I do usually start with the gut for two reasons. A, because those microbes actually can cause symptoms themselves, but also because those microbes help us absorb nutrients. And actually, if we're not absorbing our nutrients properly, then our systems are not going to be working properly.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the gut. But my background is as a health and wellbeing journalist, and over the last few years, there's definitely been a shift in even the word gut being used, and particularly looking at kind of the brain-gut axes.
Absolutely.
And obviously with fibromyalgia, a lot of people report brain fog. So is there any link then between what you eat and the bacteria in your gut potentially causing this symptom?
Absolutely, there is. So in our guts, we literally have trillions of gut bacteria, and some of them are beneficial and some of them are opportunistic, and they're all commensal. They're all supposed to be there, but they're supposed to be there in very definite amounts, and the balance between the two is what's really important. Now, the beneficial gut bacteria are the ones that love the fibers from vegetables, from fruits, from whole grains. That's their main fuel. The opportunistic bacteria, their main fuel is glucose. They love the sweets and the refined carbohydrates and those kind of things.
And they're the things that you said to potentially cut out.
And those are the things I said to potentially cut out. Now, those kind of things tend to drive inflammation anyway from a kind of glucose point of view, but they also tend to be really low in nutrients as well, because if you think that a grain, the majority of the nutrients, the vitamins and minerals, tend to be in the outer husk of the grain, and when you're actually refining that grain, you're losing lots of those nutrients. So not only when you have a refined grain are you feeding the opportunistic bacteria, but you're also not giving the body the nutrients it needs for health. So diet has a massive impact on the gut bacterial balance, but also on our nutrient status from a carbohydrate point of view.
How then, what's kind of the easiest way to check somebody's gut bacteria then? Do you have to do loads of tests?
You don't have to do loads of tests. So I work in two ways, because I work with a really big cross-section of people. So I work with some people who have the money to do testing, and I have worked with some people who don't have the money to do testing. So for the people who do have the money to do testing, I tend to do comprehensive stool analysis, they're brilliant. They give you a really good idea of what's happening in the gut, and they're different to what they do on the NHS, because on the NHS you're looking for kind of bacteria and pathogens that shouldn't be there. The comprehensive stool analysis that I do have some crossover, because they also look for bacteria and pathogens that shouldn't be there, but then they're looking at what bacterial balance you have. So they'll look at your commensal bacteria, which is the bacteria that's supposed to be in the gut. They'll look at your beneficial bacteria and tell me exactly what's there and in what amounts. They'll look at the opportunistic bacteria, tell me exactly what's there and in what amounts. But the other thing they do is they look at inflammatory markers in the gut, and they also look at immune markers in the gut. So about 60% of our gut, 60% of our immune system is actually in our gut. And one of the main complexes is something called secretory IgA, and so it will tell me the levels of secretory IgA. It will also look at some of the markers for intestinal permeability, all of those kind of things. And while we're thinking of the gut, and you were mentioning mood, very few people know that more serotonin, our happy hormone, is actually created in the gut by our gut bacteria than in the brain. So that gives you some idea of how important the gut is.
So you have to keep your guts happy to keep your brain happy.
So you have to keep your guts happy to keep your brain happy.
What are serotonin-rich foods that people can incorporate in their diet?
So, that's a difficult one, really, because there's not really a serotonin-rich food. Serotonin's a neurotransmitter, and you need a variety of nutrients to feed the production of that neurotransmitter.
Okay, so anything that's kind of rich in specific minerals or vitamins?
So again, it's about a healthy diet. So it's about vitamins and minerals come from a variety of foods. So again, vegetables, fruits, good sources of proteins, whole grains, nuts and seeds, those kind of things will all give you the substrates that you need for good neurotransmitter production.
And then on the flip side as well, is it, correct me if I'm wrong, but our gut also holds a lot of stress. So equally it's looking at combating that as well.
So I'm not sure I would say that the gut holds a lot of stress, but stress can affect the way the gut works in several ways. So the first thing is that when we're stressed, we produce a hormone called cortisol. Yeah. And cortisol's main job is to release stores of glycogen from the liver, which raises our blood sugar levels. Even if we're not eating a particularly rich in sugar diet, that sugar can feed the gut bacterial balance, so that can that sugar can feed the opportunistic bacteria, which then can alter that gut bacterial balance. But the other thing is that when we're stressed, we tend not to secrete as much digestive enzymes as normally. So things like, just breaking down your food and absorbing the nutrients will be affected. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is that stress can actually change the motility of the gut. So for some people, that means that food passes through their system too quickly. And for some people, that means that their food doesn't pass through their system quickly enough. Right. So stress affects the gut rather than being held in the gut.
So absorption seems to be quite a big factor too, then. Yeah. So how can somebody kind of make sure that they are absorbing things in the best possible way? Is that kind of getting the right balance of nutrients and minerals that work together? Because I know there's certain things that you need to have one thing with another thing in order for absorption to happen.
Exactly. So, nutrients work very much synergistically. Mm-hmm. And for instance, B vitamins is a really good example of that. I would never suggest to somebody that they supplement a single B vitamin because they all work synergistically together. And similarly with absorption, you actually need certain nutrients to ensure things like, you need zinc for digestive enzyme production, vitamin A, those kind of things. So it really is about having a varied diet and making sure you're getting all those nutrients. Absorption, this sounds really crazy, but we all live such busy lives that we tend to eat really quickly and on the move. Actually, chewing is the first part of digestion, and none of us chew well enough. So we're sending food to the gut that hasn't actually been broken up. So, just stopping and chewing your food properly helps with absorption and digestion. Actually, stopping, taking a few deep breaths before you start eating just moves you from that kind of fight or flight sympathetic nervous system to the rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system. So, just little things like that can make such a difference to the amount that you're actually absorbing and therefore the amount of nutrients that you're giving your body to work properly.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because stress and even kind of things like ME and fibromyalgia seem to kind of fall into that category of a more kind of modern disease, when we're living these faster paced lifestyles, and it is sometimes those tiny simple things, as you say, that we're not chewing quick enough because we're just always on the go, that is actually having this huge effect.
Yeah, and the other side of that always being on the go is we tend to eat an awful lot more kind of ready prepared and ready processed foods, which naturally are lower in nutrients than foods that you cook at home from scratch. It's as simple as that. There are very few ready meals or ready-made meals that you can buy that have as many nutrients as there would be if you cooked them yourselves.
Lots of people then who are living these kind of fast-paced lifestyles, they often rely on taking vitamins as a supplement. What's your take on that? Not getting them through your diet, but instead getting them as an over-the-counter pill.
Okay, so I do use supplements. I don't think supplements are a alternative to a good diet. I think you need to start with a good diet and use supplements as a adjunct to that or an add-on to that. people often say to me, should everybody take a multivitamin, for instance? And I say to people, well, it really depends on you. It depends on your symptoms. If you're showing symptoms, then you may actually need higher doses of nutrients that you can get from your diet. And actually, our diets, nutrient content has changed considerably. If we had been looking at the nutrients in foods 50 years ago, they would be very different to the nutrients in foods now for several reasons. Our food is, our fields are over farmed.
Yeah.
We rely an awful lot on things being picked early and transported to us. Things sit on the supermarket shelves. All of those things, kind of reduce the nutrient content of them. Whereas 50 years ago, people had allotments. We'd get our groceries from locally.
Yeah.
Or from, they had different nutrient content. So if you're well and healthy and you have no symptoms and you eat a good varied diet, then no, you shouldn't need to take a supplement. But if you are someone with fibromyalgia, the chances are that you are likely to need higher doses of certain vitamins to, reduce inflammation, to drive energy production, those kind of things.
What are the most common deficiencies that people have?
Okay, so the first one I would say is, and this is very common, is vitamin D. Mm-hmm. And actually vitamin D, one of the symptoms of low vitamin D is joint pain. So that gives you some idea. We live in the Northern Hemisphere, or I live in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm not sure if everyone listening to this podcast does, but it's thought that a really high proportion of people who live in the Northern Hemisphere are deficient in vitamin D, so much so that in England, the Public Health England actually suggests that everybody over the age of 1 supplements vitamin D.
Wow.
Very few people do that. And even if they do, the government guidelines are quite low, and those guidelines are great for stopping deficiency, but they're not great for actually rectifying a deficiency. So if you're coming to it already low in vitamin D, then the government guidelines may not be high enough to actually rectify that deficiency. So I'd say if I had to pick a nutrient deficiency that's the most common with people I'd see, it's definitely vitamin D.
Yeah, that definitely isn't one that's kind of in my everyday thinking about. I must be taking that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's such a high proportion. That's so interesting.
And actually, Public Health England this year changed their advice, as far as I'm aware, because they used to say take a vitamin D supplement between October and March, so during the winter months. But with the current virus around, they're actually saying keep going with that vitamin D, because vitamin D is not only about joint pain, but it actually helps to modulate the immune system. So it's a good one when there's viruses around. But, we're talking about fibromyalgia, which tends to be an autoimmune condition. And if you haven't got enough vitamin D to modulate the immune system, it can be triggered inappropriately.
Yeah, and I'm sure our lack of holidays are not helping with the vitamin D.
Our lack of holidays are definitely not helping. And, as far as I'm aware, that not many of us are out there in our bikinis in the sunshine all the time, getting good levels of sun to convert to vitamin D. So it definitely has an impact. Another one that's really quite common is, essential fatty acids. People can be low in that. With fibromyalgia, I often find people are low in things like magnesium. Mm-hmm. So magnesium is a great mineral. It is involved in so many enzymes and functions the body does. So it's needed for energy production. But it's also needed to help relax smooth muscles. So, if you have tightness or tension in your muscles, it's really nice one to help relax smooth muscles, which can help relieve pain.
And for that, as well as taking a supplement, would you recommend people bathing in magnesium salts? Does that help too?
Yes, so Epsom salt baths are really useful. You have to be slightly careful of Epsom salt baths because you don't necessarily want to be revving up detoxification too much. And Epsom salts contain magnesium sulfate. So the magnesium is great transdermally. It can help with that. Great one to have before you go to bed because it definitely helps with sleep. But the sulfate can supports detoxification phases, and you don't want to just be supporting one pathway in detoxification. You want to be supporting the liver generally. So I would say Epsom salt baths are great. I just wouldn't do them more than 2 or 3 times a week.
Right, okay. And what do you feel about, because when I kind of think about gut health and things like that, I know a lot of people, have those yogurt drinks and those kind of probiotic drinks. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about those?
So I would say that you are probably better off looking at actual probiotics that contain the freeze-dried bacteria rather than the yogurt drinks. The yogurt drinks don't tend to have that much of the bacteria in them, but they also, to make them palatable, they either put sugar or artificial sweeteners in them, and actually both of those have been shown to imbalance the gut bacteria, so you're almost giving with one and taking with the other hand, if you see what I mean. So my view, and it is literally my view, is actually taking the freeze-dried probiotics is a better option.
Interesting. So then with your patients, is there kind of a time frame of change? By changing your diet, do you say you should feel the effects in X amount of weeks, months, etc.?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. I wish I had an easy answer to that, because like I said at the beginning, what are the causes for one person are different to the causes for another person, and actually one individual may have several causes. So for some people, we're really lucky, we crack it first time round. I think probably my biggest success story is a lady who literally was carried into my consulting room, and I used to work at an osteopathic clinic, and she had to lie on the osteopath's bed because she couldn't sit up for the hour and a half that I was talking to her.
And this is somebody with fibromyalgia.
She was a lady with fibromyalgia, and 8 weeks later she walked in, and I literally was completely gobsmacked, and she was like, oh yeah, I can walk, I can cook now, I can do the dishes. It was just like miraculous, and that I wish I could do that for everyone. Sadly, some people are much more complicated, and some people it's almost like peeling the layers of an onion, and each layer is a different thing that we're dealing with. I mean, I tend to work with really quite complex cases as well. So for some people, there's mold toxicity, or there's, latent Epstein-Barr virus, or there's Lyme disease, or there's any number of things that could be contributing. If everybody, it was just a question of food intolerances, or, rectifying nutrient deficiencies, or healing the gut and balancing the gut bacterial balance, life would be really easy, but sadly it's not. So I'd say for some people, you'd see a miraculous, very quick response. For some people, it can take a while. It really depends what has caused that person's fibromyalgia.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And it's not quite as simple as just changing somebody's diet then. Presumably, do you kind of recommend other lifestyle changes to work in synergy as well, or other forms of treatment as well?
Absolutely, I do. So I'm a functional medicine nutritionist, so I work, functional medicine is basically about looking at all the systems of the body and trying to work out what the underlying causes are for that person's symptoms. So we're not treating the symptoms, we're looking at rectifying the underlying causes. So for those people, we're looking at all sorts of things. We're looking at hormones, we're looking at inflammatory pathways, we're looking at detoxification, we're looking at digestion. One of the things that I've found is a real commonality with people with fibromyalgia and other kind of fibromyalgia-like conditions like chronic fatigue and ME is there is very, very often a stress element, or a stress in the past element. There's a whole new area of research looking at something called ACEs, which are adverse childhood events. Right. And past life stress or current stress, I personally don't think that if that is part of the picture, those people are going to get better unless that stress is dealt with. So I very often will suggest that people address that stress either by, going to a counsellor or a psychologist, or doing daily meditation or guided relaxation, or I often, with people whose stress is a factor, look at the Gupta program or DNRS, which is Dynamic Neural Retraining System, which are both online programs which are a variety of kind of cognitive exercises and meditations to to help move the body, as I said before, from the sympathetic nervous system, that fight and flight, over to the parasympathetic nervous system. So the body's not thinking that everything is a stress, and if we can add that piece of the jigsaw, that often makes a big difference.
So when you're talking about stress, is that fall in the same category as kind of trauma? So whether that's kind of somebody's parents divorcing when they're children, or going through some kind of big life event that they perhaps don't deal with.
A bereavement or, something like that.
And then the body is manifesting that.
Yeah.
Into life. Wow, it's you're so right. It's such a jigsaw puzzle, and it so needs to be looked at holistically. I wonder, it's your profession and you're helping lots of people through it, but it took you having fibromyalgia to get to that position, and actually lots of people that I've spoken to who now work in the field of fibromyalgia is because they experienced it.
Yes.
Which, it seems like we shouldn't be relying on people having to have experienced it to then help other people. How can we kind of get more people interested in the area, or recognizing that food and diet need to be spoken about much further, like at the beginning of the journey?
Yeah. I wish I knew the answer to that. I think, like I said before, I think things are changing and people are considering diet a bit more. I still think there's an awful lot of people who, aren't or won't consider it. I had a client the other day who had Crohn's disease, and her gastroenterologist had told her that what she ate made no difference whatsoever. And you just kind of think, well, how can that possibly be a thing? How can that work? So I think there's still an awful lot of people who don't want to acknowledge it, or don't know how to acknowledge it because they haven't got the knowledge. I do think it's changing. I think there are quite a lot of doctors who are training to be functional medicine doctors. I think functional medicine itself is being acknowledged more. I actually think health is changing. I think that the issue is that many years ago, disease fit into nice little boxes. So you had a heart attack, you were treated by a cardiologist, or you got a virus, you were treated by an immunologist. I think nowadays there is so much going on that we don't fit into nice little boxes, and I think fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, ME is a perfect example of that, because there isn't a pill that fixes everybody. There isn't a treatment that fixes everybody, because what's causing...
or a specialist. You could see a rheumatologist or a nutritional therapist, so many different...
Exactly. So I think that's where the dilemma comes, because actually these conditions don't fit into the conventional medicine model. And so I think that it is going to have to change, and it's interesting because I work with a group of practitioners, and we were having a conversation the other day, and my colleague said, do you think people are getting sicker, or is it just us that are seeing people that are getting sicker? Because we all deal with such complex cases, and none of them fit into this nice little box that we can just say, here, have this medicine and you'll feel better, because it doesn't work that way anymore. So I'm hopeful that things are going to change. And as I said, I think there is a slight shift towards prevention rather than cure. I think it was in 2007, the government commissioned this huge foresight report, which looked at disease and primary care and what was going to happen. And at the time, they said that by 2040, 50, I think they said, that if it carried on the way it was going, the NHS was not going to be able to cope.
Yeah.
It was, so we had to be looking at prevention rather than cure. And that's where, quite a lot of the government eating campaigns came about and those kind of things. So I think there is a shift. I just think it's a slow shift, and I don't think it's moving quite fast enough for lots of people.
No, but that's a fairly positive note to be ending on. So for anybody
Absolutely.
that is, I suppose there's still, I don't know whether you feel this in your line of work, but potentially a little bit of stigma for people. They wouldn't necessarily trust going to see a nutritional therapist over their primary caregiver, for example. What would you say to people that are still a bit dubious about this form of treatment?
Okay, I think that's very valid, and I tell you why I think it's very, very valid, and that is because nutritional therapy is not a protected title. Mm-hmm. So anybody can say that they're a nutritional therapist.
Yeah.
You can do a weekend course and call yourself a nutritional therapist, and that is a real problem. So I would say to you, if you are considering going to see a nutritional therapist, do make sure that they're properly trained. So, I work at the London Clinic of Nutrition. We are all degree trained. We all come at this from a science point of view rather than anything else point of view. So, look at someone's credentials, check that they're properly qualified, check that they're a member of a regulatory body. So, for instance, the British Association of Nutritional Therapists, or BANT, you can actually find a practitioner that is properly trained to be a BANT member. You actually have to have done a certain level of education. You can't be a BANT member and have done a weekend course. So I think that is a very valid worry, that people think, well, what do these people know, and do they have any science or medical backgrounds whatsoever? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't know how to say this. I was going to say it's not going to do any harm. It's actually, addressing your diet is going to be a benefit. Yeah. Whether it is the thing that makes you better, I don't know. And I never, ever say to somebody, I've got your magic bullet. I will never say to someone, absolutely come and see me, I can make you better, because I don't know if I can until I try, and until I know I've found that thing that's affecting that one person. So that's the other thing. I'm very skeptical of practitioners who tell people that they can fix them, because they don't know that they can. But as we said earlier, very often people will come to me as a last resort. They've been through every other possible, medical area and alternative therapy, and they've come to me as a last resort. And a lot of people will say to me, man, I wish I'd have done this 10 years ago, so.
Okay, so it's people do their research on their nutritional therapists.
Definitely.
And changing your diet is never going to be a bad thing.
Changing your diet is never going to be a bad thing. What I will say to you is, don't be forced to go and see a nutritional therapist. Going to see a nutritional therapist requires some work on your part. Mm-hmm. So if your mother or your husband or your daughter is making you go, you're very unlikely that you want to embrace it. To actually get benefit from nutritional therapists, you need to embrace it and actually work with that person and make positive changes for yourself. It's not something that I can do for you. It's something that we do together.
Yeah, it's assume it's kind of a lifelong change. It's not a quick fix.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there are things that I can eat now that I couldn't eat. Mm-hmm. I am not 15, 20 years down the line from seeing that nutritional therapist and still avoiding all of those foods. Actually, I eat all of those foods. I just eat them in moderation, and I have a much more varied, nutrient-rich diet. So it's not something that, you're not going to have to, of course, unless you are celiac, you're not going to have to avoid gluten forever. You're not going to have to avoid sugar forever. The thing about sugar is that when I was growing up, we used to have a sweet at the weekend. We didn't used to have sweets and sugar every day, so it's about change, really.
Jacqui, this has been so interesting. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's fascinating to talk about all this stuff. I could talk about food and nutrition for hours, but I'll let you go now, and I will go and source some vitamin D.
or get your vitamin D tested. That's one thing I would say. You know, you can get your vitamin D tested so cheaply. Either your consultant or your GP can do it for you, or if they're unwilling to, which some still are, the NHS Trust in Birmingham do a home finger prick test, which costs all of £29. Easy as pie to get it tested. It's good to know what your vitamin D level is if you have fibromyalgia.
On that note, I'll be ordering myself a fingerprint kit. Thank you so much, Jacqui.
My pleasure. Lovely to talk to you.
The content on this podcast is for informational purposes only, and because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions.